voice memo with Sean on the 26th of April in Cirque Downpatrick.
Alright, so do you want to get started?
Yes.
So let's start with basics, because I've trawled through your website. There's not much about you. So when and where were you born?
I was born in Ballymena and grew up in Port Glenone.
Right, okay.
Country boy.
And your education, so what schools did you go to? Qualifications?
I went to the Rainey Endowed School and stayed there until I did my A-levels. Got GCSEs, didn't get A-levels, then went to art college, studied foundation art at the University of Ulster in Belfast. And then from there, I applied to art colleges to study photography in England. Didn't get into the one I wanted to, so I took a year, applied to West Surrey, Farnham. Didn't get in, so I took a year out and was an assistant to a photographer in Belfast, where I worked for free for a year. And his name was Christopher Hill. He's a really good photographer, a landscape photographer. Was probably sort of the top commercial photographer in Belfast for years. Then worked with him for a year, reapplied to university, and then applied to go to Bournemouth and studied photography at Bournemouth.
Right, I see. So how did you get your start in the photography world, apart from working for Christopher Hill?
So that was only a year, and it was work, but it was unpaid work. Went to uni, did art college, then moved to London after art college. And in London just started to freelance as a photographer, taking my portfolio around, asking people for work. Didn't get any work, started doing some unpaid voluntary work for people in magazines. Got a little bit of work from, community groups and charities, and mostly really unpaid voluntary work to get experience. And then started getting a little bit of paid work for magazines. Then my first sort of break was, I heard on the radio, this was just after the fall of the Soviet Union, so all the countries were sort of collapsing, and Romania had just had a civil war at Christmas, and the dictator was called Ceausescu, and he was killed, and the country had a revolution. And there was an appeal on the radio to send a group were collecting food and clothing to send over to Romania, and they were putting it in trucks and driving it all the way across Europe, and they were asking for people to get involved. So I rang them up and said I could take photographs on their trip for publicity if they wanted, and they said come over and we'll have a chat. So they said you can come on the trip with us to Romania if you can drive a van, because they had 3 vans and about 8 HGV trucks. So I got another friend of mine to help out, and he drove a van, and we drove all the way from London across through Europe to the Black Sea. I took photographs of the trip, took photographs of the places we arrived in, and then drove all the way back. So that took about 2 weeks. And that worked, got some publicity from them, went on another trip with them, used that. Didn't get paid for that, but then used that portfolio and got some work out of it. Would you believe it? The person who paid for that trip was a millionaire who was very charitable, and he was on the trip driving a truck. He's a truck driver, that's how he made his money. And he said, could you come and photograph my car collection? Okay. Because I've got a collection of classic cars. He collected Aston Martins, and he lived in Guernsey. So he had a couple of garages full of Aston Martins, millions of pounds worth of cars. He collected them for the last 10 or 15 years and wanted them photographed. So I photographed them for him. He paid me. I took the money he gave me, and when I was working for him, I read an article in a newspaper that said about refugees escaping from Albania. Albania was still Soviet country, the last Soviet country, and they were escaping across the border to Greece. So you can't get into Albania. They won't give you a visa to go and take photographs or to visit. But I could get to Greece and travel up to the border and photograph the refugees. So I took the money he paid me for that, photographing his cars. then got a flight to Athens, got a bus, an overnight 8-hour bus all the way up through Greece, right up to the border with Albania. And then met people who were working there, and there's lots of refugees just walking over the hills every night trying to escape, and photographed them and their stories. Came back, got a bus, overnight bus back again down to Athens, flew back to London, dumped my bag at the house, went to the Guardian newspaper and said, I've got some films here. And I was being a bit sly because developing films cost a lot of money, and it's hard to do on your own, and it still costs money, and I didn't have a lot of money, so I had about 20-30 rolls of film. So I gave the film to them and they processed it all for me, and then they said, what's good here? And I said, that's new, and that was taken yesterday, that was taken the day before, and they printed some of my pictures in the magazine about the story about the refugees coming out at the border. So that was, I got one picture there in the magazine, in the newspaper, which paid quite well, and I got all my film processed. So then I was able to go back to them a few weeks later and say, I'm planning another trip. And they said, oh, you're the guy that was in last week with those photographs. And they said they couldn't pay me because I wasn't working for them, and I wasn't well enough known, and I wasn't a famous photographer. They couldn't pay me. But if you go, will you bring your pictures to us before you show anyone else, so they get first look at anything I do? I said, sure, when I come back I'll give you a first look. And they said, if you give you a first look, we'll give you some film. And they give me a box of film with about 30 rolls of film. That's about 200 quid worth of film. So obviously I was delighted. Free film. Went off to, where did I go? Mozambique. There was a drought in Mozambique. Made some connections with people who worked in Mozambique. Flew to South Africa, got a connecting flight to Mozambique, travelled again on a bus and a tractor and a train for 6 or 7 hours up to the area where the drought was. Took some pictures of the drought for a week. Back in 6 or 7 hours in the tractors and buses, and back to the airport, back to Johannesburg back to London. Went to the Guardian and said, look, yesterday I was in Mozambique and this is really current pictures. And they went, oh right, that's very good because that's a very current story. They said, hold on here, we'll process your film. They processed the films and come back, and I can remember it very clearly. It was about 8 o'clock in the evening. I had just come back that morning. I'd been travelling for 2 days. And the guy went, give us all the details you have on this. We're going to ring our correspondent. And she had gone home. She came back. She wired in a story, and the guy said, "You might be in luck. I think there's a gap on the front page." And all right. Literally, they had nothing for the front page, and it was 8 o'clock at night, and I had just walked in the door an hour earlier, and he said, "Yeah." I gave him all the details. And he said, "Keep an eye out. That should go in." They could obviously, in other words, "Can you please go now?" And I went home, and up the next morning, bought the newspaper, and my pictures on the front page of the Guardian, which is a pretty big deal. And that was it. From that, I just did another thing, and just tried to kept selling my pictures.
So you mentioned that you were using film at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still use film, or do you prefer film to working digitally?
Everything I do now is digital. Haven't shot on film for years. My work doesn't really depend on the medium. It doesn't really matter. You could shoot it on film, you could shoot it on digital. It doesn't really matter. The quality from digital is good enough for what I want. A lot of people do shoot film, but I don't have the facilities to process it, and I also don't have the money to shoot film. It's very expensive, so yeah, all digital.
No, it's just the reason I asked, prepare for a real professional transition here, is you've mentioned Todd Hido as an influence. He works in film, but I'm wondering, do you have anyone else or anything else that would influence your work?
Yes, Todd Hido's work obviously is quite influential, although I don't think he works in film anymore. His work, he would talk a lot about his work, a body of work. Some of it was shot 15, 20 years ago. Some of it was shot 2 years ago, and it's all in the same body. He does shoot a lot of it was shot in film, but I've seen videos of him recently shooting in digital.
Okay. So would anyone like Christopher Lee, or I know you've mentioned the Dutch masters,
yes,
of painting, tend to be influenced?
So the project I have been working on for a few years, 3 or 4 years now. It's still not finished. Photographing landscapes at night around the country and photographing roadside signs. It's that sort of twilight zone, so that it's half day, half night. There's a transition there, and the scenes are lit up by the traffic of cars going past. So there's an artificial light, but you can't see the source of the light because the cars aren't in the picture, but the car headlights light up the scene. So that's quite important, and that would be very influenced. Originally, yes, the idea of that dark images with light in them was an inspiration by Todd Heido. The inspiration for these images are to get that painterly, like the Dutch masters did with their paintings, that control of light and that sort of dreamlike. Not because that's something I want to achieve, but because it's that artificial, better than reality. They were painting something to make it look better. The Hudson River painters, not so much the Dutch masters, the Hudson River painters, or a bunch of painters in the States, whenever America was this new land, it was a group of painters along the Hudson River, obviously, which was the way to get... America was colonised from the coast. Civilization was at the coast, and then as further you went in, there was less civilization. So when they went up the river, they were going into this wilderness. This idea about beyond here, we don't know what there is, and it's a wild wilderness. And they were all very religious European people, so they kept thinking of God's unspoilt land, like the Garden of Eden, or the landscape, like the early landscape painters painted, the idea of Albion, England, this beautiful countryside, this dream-like place. It's not a real place. It didn't relate to reality. So they photographed their landscape in that way to make it look like a biblical scene. So I kind of thought the biblical scene idea suited the idea of the roadside signs and the text, which is often a biblical text, although usually not uplifting. It's usually a condemnation about death and judgment. Yes, and sinners.
Yes, so is there anything you look for in particular when you're out location scouting or taking pictures? Is there anything that you go, yes, or is it just something that slowly builds on you over time?
Both of those. When a project starts, you're all excited about this might work. So you're finding a thing, and then you find another thing, and then you find another thing, and you think, oh, this is what I'm looking for, because you don't know what you're looking for until you see something and it chimes with you, or you think, oh, that's definitely not it. I did that, and that's definitely not what I'm looking for, so I'll not do it like that anymore. So there's a little bit of that, and then after you've been doing a project for a while, it gets a little bit repetitive. So you end up thinking, well, I've seen that before, and I've done a version of this, and that's very like that. So then you start to look for things that are different. With this project, you're looking for different road signs with different text or a different location. So I'm now thinking, well, I've seen that same wording 100 times, so I'm not really interested in that. If you find one that's got interesting wording, or you find a location, like I've got lots of countryside ones, I've got a few in that sort of urban, suburban boundary where there are houses in it, but you're not in a town, you're in a countryside where there are some housing. I've got a few of those. I'm now working on ones where there's lots of housing, so it's more urban, and I'm also scouting out places that I have really very rural, so seaside locations. I'm looking for ones. That's the ones I'm working on, the current seaside locations, or ones where you can see mountains and landscapes in the background, and thinking that would be perfect because I haven't got enough of those, and I want to have a brag.
So I wanted to ask you mainly about two of your projects, Looking at God and Liminal.
Mm-hmm.
What were the main sort of themes that you wanted to portray in these?
The liminal one came first, and Looking at God came after. So Looking at God came out of liminal. Liminal was using... Suppose I was working on a project about identity in Northern Ireland, and it came out of, this is a long answer to your question, working for newspapers and magazines. I was working for a photographic agency, and you often got people asking and saying, oh, can you follow this journalist, a journalist coming from New York or Germany or France, they're going to do a thing, an update on the Northern Ireland scene. Can you travel around with them for a day or two? And you travel around taking photographs of people that they talk to or places that they go and things that they want to photograph. And quite often they would say to you as a local person, we need some, like, we're going to do photographs from the Protestant side and photographs from the Catholic side, so we've got to get a good balance of pictures. And you try to photograph everything you can, and there seems quite often to be a conversation between me and the journalist where they're saying, the nationalist community are telling me they're striving to throw off the British Empire and break free from England and unite Ireland as one country, and this is their goal. And that's easy to talk about and easy to photograph people who want that. And they're saying, but somehow the people on the Protestant side don't know what they want. They know what they don't want, which is Ireland, united Ireland, but they don't know what they do want, and they have nothing, no goal to aim for. And often my pictures were very difficult to show a photograph of something that's not there. So people are aspiring to have a free Ireland or a united Ireland. You can take pictures associated with that. When people are aspiring for things to not change and things not to go forward, that's very hard to photograph. So I then thought, how could I photograph that? So working with the Loyalist community, I grew up in a Protestant community, and it's a reasonably difficult thing to talk to people about. So I thought that would be something worth photographing. So after doing a lot of other parts of the project, photographed architecture, buildings, streets, flags, murals, the usual stuff. Photographed people. I came across the idea that photographing the buildings that people themselves thought were important. So in the community, churches play a very important part, and every village has 5 different types of churches. And they're all completely different to the people who go there. And the people who don't go there, they're just churches. So I thought, right, this community thinks churches are very important. So if I photograph the churches, the buildings would tell you a little bit about the people who built them. So if anybody gives you something and says, this is very precious to me, you can use that as a little way of analysing who they are without analysing them. You analyse what's important to them. So it's almost a little bit of an investigation, like a detective TV show. You're trying to work out who would live in a house like this, who would think this is important, and what is it about it's important, and why is it important. Sometimes to tackle a problem face on is quite hard, so it's easier to sort of go around the sides and attack it from the sides. So the idea of looking at it a little bit sideways on and not looking at the people, but looking at the things that the people think are important, and that was their churches. So I thought liminal was about the liminal spaces and why they're built that way, why they look like that, and what the feeling is of those churches, and what that gives you an idea about, hopefully, about the people.
And looking at God came out of that and represented.
Yeah, I don't know what it represents. It was more of a bit of an investigation, because looking at God is a continuation of that idea, forgetting about the buildings this time, and looking again a little bit about, that's a very specific type of a Protestant religious identity that is kind of in the background a lot in a country like Ireland. Even in modern Ireland, there's an undercurrent of religion. So often people have come from a very religious family or have got some kind of religious indoctrination or training or education that they may not hold anymore, but I think it's kind of forms you a little bit. So we're only kind of a generation away from that. So these are like throwbacks. With photography, you're always looking for a physical sign of something. So you can't photograph something that's not there, but essentially you're using something that's there to. They're like signposts that are pointing towards something. So it's called indexicality. The theory of indexicality, which everything is an index that points towards something else. So like you can look at somebody and assess by the kind of clothes they're wearing, you can assess a little bit about their personality. There's a certain indexicality to landscapes. where you look at the signs and signals. I thought, right, so these road signs are also signals pointing towards what kind of a society we have, or what kind of a person puts that up there, or what would it feel like, hopefully, in the images. What would I feel like if I was there, standing beneath that sign, in that landscape? Now, obviously, you photograph a field of corn on a moonlit night and a lamppost. Now, that corn doesn't have an opinion. The lamppost doesn't hold a political view. The road doesn't have an opinion. But you put them all together in a certain way, and it feels like there's something being portrayed here. These elements have got together and been, admittedly, I compose it in a certain way, but also I'm sort of fine-tuning and editing out things that I'm seeing in the environment, and thinking this environment is almost putting across a feeling or an emotion or a point of view that you as a traveller or as a journeyer through that landscape would feel. So that's the motivation for that one, and has not quite resolved yet.
So when you talk about your composition, when you compose a photo, do you base it more off of a mathematical rule of thirds, or is it more of this feels right?
I've never thought of the rule of thirds, never used it, never been in my head. I know it's a big deal whenever we're teaching, because it's in all the manuals that you have to, all the prospectuses that we teach towards, but it's not a thing. It's really not a thing. I think we're very sophisticated people, and whether you know it or not, I think what happens in education, the more you learn, you get to know what you do, but you were probably doing it subconsciously before anyway. You know what pictures you like, you know what way those pictures are made, you know what looks good in your opinion. Somebody else does it a different way, you know what looks good in your opinion, and you compose, move things around and reframe things according to those, they're not rules, but according to those principles that you have. And also there's a general feeling where often you'll compose a picture that's slightly off balance, because that's reflecting something that you're feeling at the time. So it's not most of it's not thinking, most of it's feeling. So if you're feeling a little bit isolated and off balance, you tend to compose a picture which portrays isolation and unbalance. That makes sense.
So in looking at God, when you're developing the images, they do have these beautiful, almost larger than life colours, and I'm wondering, do you do that in camera or in a program?
Everything's processed digitally, and there's a lot of work. Most of them are multi-layered exposures. So you take a picture as the sun's going down, the sky's getting darker, you're getting that lovely colour in the sky, and the ground is very dark, then it's kind of in shadow. And then a car goes past and you get this beam of light. So I'm taking a picture as the car's going past, but then I have to stop the exposure before the car goes into the picture, because I don't want the car in the picture. And I'll take another picture with another car going past, and another picture with a lorry going past, and another picture of the car going a different direction. And then I bring them all into Photoshop and compile them all together. So most of those images will be compilations of 4 or 5 different images, because the tree looks nice in this picture, and the curb looks nice in that picture, and the street light looks good in that picture. So there's different cars come into a picture and they swing around and their headlights light something up. But then it was very dark in the other corner, so I'd bring a bit. So they're layered pictures. So it's the same for set the camera up, don't move the camera, just take a picture, and then take lots of pictures over the period of an hour, sometimes maybe 2 hours. And then out of that you'll get 4 or 5 pictures that work, and then those are combined together to make one sort of uber picture where the lighting, you take the best bit of all of them and you just layer them up in Photoshop. It's very easy.
Right.
It's a bit of a cheat, but it's also a little bit like painting with light. I'm using the light that's already there, but I'm compiling up layers to make an image which never existed. But then that's the essence of photography, because no still image ever existed until you take it. The colours and the really strong overbearing skies, and quite a lot of them are about that sort of romantic painterly thing I was talking about before, those painterly landscapes where they're portraying a scene, like the plains of heaven, by John Martin. John Martin's a famous religious painter, so he painted biblical scenes. They call them biblical scenes. They're not scenes that, not like here's the crucifixion or here's the birth of Jesus. They were scenes about Bible stories, scenes that never happened, but he then makes it look like they did happen, or he's predicting the future. He's predicting the judgment of the nation. And these paintings he made were massive, 3 meters wide, 2 meters high, with great titles like The Wrath of His Judgment or The Plains of Heaven. They were very, very sensuous, overwhelming skies and green fields and little tribe of angels running through the fields and sheep and rivers. Well, the next one would be a red sky with a bolt of lightning and people, a cliff being hit by lightning and people falling off the cliff into the pit of hell. So these paintings were a phenomenon at the time, back in the late 1800s, and travelled around the whole of the UK. They went to theatres. They had light shows where they had magic lanterns that lit them up and changed colours and made it look like they were alive. And there were 3 or 4 of them would tour together. People would pay 2p to go and see the show and watch these 4 pictures as they changed. And they reckon over the period of a year or 2, when he was travelling around the country, he travelled around town halls and theatres, music halls, that over 2 million people saw these pictures. And there only were 4 of them, and they travelled around the country. They were a phenomenon. And then you could buy prints of them, and the prints were put in books, and they became famous. And those became the idea that when you say to somebody, oh, you're going to burn in hell, they have an image in their head of what hell looks like. And very much the British sensibility was informed by him and other people like him with these massive paintings of what on earth will judgment look like. So not like Dante's horrible torturing pictures, but they had this grand epic. So they could be likened to the sort of Spielberg Hollywood blockbusters where they visualise the landing on the Normandy beaches during the war, and that becomes the thing that did you see that movie? Did you see what it looked like? They have the power, the imagination, and also the power to create something. So I sort of try and not emulate that, but very heavily rely on those same tricks and ideas when I'm composing and thinking this will work because I could put this like this. It'll be a little hint back towards what he was doing, because they are religious scenes essentially that I'm doing.
I think my final question is: are you ever going to make these 2 projects into a book? Because I'd love to buy it.
Thank you very much. There was a plan. Liminal was supposed to be put into a book. I had a publisher, and the way publishing works, photo books are expensive to make. Publishers tend to have quite a few of them stacked up. As in, yes, that's what the publisher said. Yes, I'd like to do that. It'll be a couple of years, so we'll keep in touch, and I'll be in touch with you to get a contract. And when about 2 years' time before we put it in production, so maybe another 6 months or a year after that before it comes out. So you're talking 2 or 3 years. And literally had a conversation with the publisher, and we spoke at Christmas, and he said, so I'll talk to you in January and we'll get a contract signed up because we're coming up to the time when we're going to do this. And then that was COVID. So it's now 4 years instead of 2 years. So we've had 2 years of COVID and pause, and I'm in conversation with them again now about getting it back because everything's getting back on track again. So that's the Liminal book, and I wanted to get Liminal out of the way before I did Looking at God was the plan. But there was, again, Looking at God was kind of a private project when I'm thinking, well, I'm not sure I can keep going with that, and I've got this parallel Peace Wall Stories that funding came in for doing portraits. Again, it's around the idea of identity and people, but they're portraits and they were done for that Sky TV thing, so that became the priority, and that's what I've been working on for the last 13 months, and I've just had an exhibition of that stuff up on Peace Walls, and releasing some postcards of that, and hopefully that might end up in being funded first. We'll see where that goes. There are lots of ideas about what that could be. All these things depend on, you throw out some ideas and sometimes people pick them up, so it becomes the most important one because somebody likes it.